Why did they doubt her before the mission even began, and why did she stay silent instead of defending herself? The briefing room buzzed with quiet confidence, deep voices trading numbers and plans, while she sat at the edge of the table, unnoticed. She didn't interrupt. She rarely did. It was easier to let assumptions float around her like static. She had learned that silence revealed truth faster than arguments ever could. Still, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest, that quiet ache of being underestimated, measured, dismissed before she even stepped into the field. She told herself it didn't matter. She was here for the mission, not validation. Yet when the others stood tall like mountains and she felt small among them, the doubt whispered. Not about skill, she trusted that, but about belonging. The world they were walking toward didn't reward hesitation, and she carried more of it than she ever admitted out loud. Outside, the night stretched across the mountains like a secret no one had fully understood. The team moved with practiced determination, and she followed in the last position, her steps steady, breathing controlled, mind calculating distances, wind, terrain, and the echo of every sound against the frozen stone. She felt the rhythm of movement in her bones, the climb, the strain, the uncertain silence ahead. But beneath all that, something else lingered. A question she had never asked them, and something she hadn't told them, not yet. The higher they moved into the ridge, the more the world narrowed to breath and effort. The mountain didn't care who was strongest or loudest. It demanded patience, endurance, decisions made with precision. And as they pushed forward, she wondered not whether she could keep up, but whether they would ever understand why she fought so hard to stay here, to prove nothing more than quiet competence in a world that rarely noticed it. And still she kept climbing. Why was she the only one who noticed the shadow where no shadow should have been? The trail looked empty from a distance, quiet and still, yet something felt wrong, a subtle shape that didn't align with the valley's natural lines. Her breath steadied as she watched it through the scope, her thoughts slowing, the noise of doubt fading into pure focus. She spoke up calm, firm, careful, and the hesitation in the reply cut deeper than the cold air. It wasn't just disbelief. It was something heavier. She swallowed her frustration before it could turn sharp. They didn't see what she saw. They didn't feel the tension building in the silence. And for a moment, she wondered if saying nothing would be easier. But that wasn't who she was. The world answered before anyone else could. Light sparked across the ridge. The mountain seemed to awaken all at once, sudden, overwhelming, merciless. She dropped low, instinctively grounding herself, breath tight in her throat but mind steady enough to track angles, timing, escape paths. The others scrambled for cover, voices strained, urgency swallowing confidence. The reality was simple, they were exposed, and everything ahead was locked shut. Fear edged into the moment, not panic, but the cold awareness of how thin survival could become. She saw the narrow passage beneath the ridge, a place no one else could reach. And for a heartbeat, she hesitated. Not out of fear, but because she knew what stepping forward meant. Isolation, uncertainty, silence with no one on the other side of the radio. She offered the only solution she had. The reply came with reluctance, with doubt, with a weight that reminded her how often trust is earned the hard way. But when the decision was made, there was no more room for hesitation. She moved low, fast, focused, feeling the strain in her arms and legs, the heat of adrenaline mixing with the cold of the stone beneath her hands. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from purpose. Inside the narrow crawl space, the world shrank into darkness, breath, and motion. The tunnel pressed against her shoulders, heat washing through the small passage as she pulled herself forward inch by inch. Every movement was deliberate. Every thought carried the echo of responsibility. Not for recognition, not for approval, but for the lives waiting outside, depending on someone they were only beginning to understand. And still, there was something she carried deep inside that she hadn't shared, a quiet truth about why she always chose the hardest path. What kept her moving through darkness when there was no voice answering on the radio anymore? The silence was complete, no reassurance, no guidance, only the sound of her breath and the quiet pulse of her heart in the narrow heat of the shaft. The moment felt endless, like time itself had tightened into the metal walls pressing against her arms. She felt the weight of exhaustion settling into her muscles, but she didn't let it take root. She paused when fear tried to creep in, letting it pass through like a wave rather than fight it head-on. She had made peace long ago with discomfort, with uncertainty, with being alone in places others never had to enter. Still, there was a part of her that hurt not from the climb, not from the strain, but from knowing she was out of sight, unseen in the moment she gave the most. She reached the inner corridors and felt the hum of the world beneath the facility machinery, voices in the distance, motion layered beneath the walls. Every decision she made now carried risk, not dramatic, not heroic, but deliberate. Quiet choices made in seconds that could shift the course of everything outside. She moved with restraint, with control, with intention, making space where there had been obstacles, opening paths where there were none. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts lingered on the people outside who still didn't know whether she was alive. In those moments, she wasn't thinking about success or failure, only responsibility. And within that responsibility lived an old conflict, the one that had followed her into every mission, every room, every moment she had to prove that calm strength existed even when others refused to see it. She wasn't angry, just tired of carrying it alone. But she kept going, because sometimes the only way to be heard is not through words, but through action that leaves no room for doubt. How long had she waited for someone to believe in her judgment? And how long had she believed in herself instead? When she reached the upper tower and felt the cold wind sweep across her face, the world opened wide again, the valley stretched below, the night filled with motion and chaos that looked small from above, but felt heavy inside her chest. She steadied the rifle not as a symbol of power, but as a tool requiring quiet discipline and patience. The world slowed, breath finding rhythm, thoughts aligning with each movement of the scope. She didn't think of distance or impossibility. She thought of people pinned down below, waiting for relief they couldn't see. She spoke into the radio, and for the first time since the darkness swallowed her hours earlier, a voice returned. Shock, disbelief, then something else slowly replacing it, trust. Her heart softened for a moment. Not pride, not triumph. Just relief. Shot by shot, she didn't chase perfection, she sought clarity, timing, restraint. Each moment carried weight. Each decision carried consequence. And even while fear flickered at the edge of exhaustion, she stayed grounded in purpose rather than adrenaline. As she provided cover, the doubt that had followed her into the mission didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. She heard the tone in their voices shift, not to admiration but to understanding, and that was enough. Yet the mission wasn't finished, and the hardest questions always come when victory feels close enough to touch but far enough to lose. There was still one choice left, one decision no one could make for her, and one moment where success meant accepting the possibility of failure in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. Why did the final decision feel less like courage and more like acceptance? The convoy in the distance was moving farther and farther away, the world narrowing again into numbers, time, and a dwindling chance. She listened to the voice in her ear, urgent, uncertain, but her focus shifted inward. This wasn't about skill anymore. It was about trust in her experience, her judgment, her quiet years of unseen discipline. The wind tugged at her sleeves. The metal beneath her hands trembled with cold. Her breath slowed until it formed a rhythm with the steady beat of her heart. She did the calculations, not rushed, not desperate, but patient, reflective, almost calm. Every factor layered into the next until the impossible wasn't a challenge, just a question. Could she live with not trying? The answer came from somewhere deep, somewhere quiet. She took the shot not with hope, but with resolve. And in the long silence that followed, she thought about every moment that had led here. Every doubt, every oversight, every time someone looked past her and never saw the depths she carried inside. When the confirmation came at last, there was no celebration in her chest, only a quiet, fragile stillness. She didn't feel invincible. She didn't feel legendary. She just felt human. And for the first time, she heard respect in the voices calling her name, not because of the distance she reached, but because of the courage it took to stand steady in the face of disbelief. What stayed with her long after the mission ended, the victory or the silence afterward? The extraction felt unreal, footsteps in the snow, breath in the cold, the weight of exhaustion pressing deep into her bones. Their eyes met at last, and in that moment there were no speeches, no apologies, no dramatic acknowledgments. Only a nod. And that was enough. Later, when the noise faded and the world returned to routine, she thought about the mountain, the darkness, the narrow passage only she could walk through. She thought about how strength can be quiet, unnoticed, invisible until the moment it becomes undeniable. She didn't carry pride away from the mission. She carried something softer, a sense of peace that came not from proving others wrong, but from staying true to the quiet resilience that had always lived inside her. She knew doubt would appear again someday. She knew there would be new rooms, new faces, new assumptions. But now something had changed. Not in them, in her. Because she finally understood what she had been trying to prove, not to the world, but to herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence feel heavier than the gunfire had moments before? And why did it bother her more than the danger itself? When the echoes faded and the night settled back into the frozen valley, she stayed low behind the jagged stone, listening not to the chaos ahead, but to the quiet inside her own chest. Her breath was steady, controlled, disciplined, yet something in her heart lingered between tension and hesitation, as if a question had been asked of her that she still hadn't answered. The others spoke in sharp, clipped phrases calling distance, cover, angles, but she listened past their words. She listened for tone, for that unspoken mixture of urgency and doubt that had followed her since the moment they first glanced her way. She wasn't angry about it. Anger would have made things louder. What she felt instead was weight. Not from the mission, from expectation. And the truth that, even here, even now, she was still fighting two battles at once, the one on the ground and the one inside. The ridge ahead looked deceptively still, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Snow drifted across the stone in thin silver sheets, catching faint light from the clouds above. Nothing moved, yet everything felt alive. Tension lived in the empty spaces between the shadows, in the small details others overlooked, in the places where uncertainty hid just beneath the surface. She watched, not because she was cautious, but because patience had always been her advantage. And patience had always been misunderstood. She noticed the faint break in the natural lines first, a shape too measured, too intentional. The wind brushed it, but the shadow didn't shift with the others. It didn't belong. She felt it before she confirmed it, instinct moving before words did, memory and discipline tightening around her senses like a second heartbeat. So she spoke. Calm, measured, confident, even as doubt echoed back through the headset. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that said more than disagreement ever could. She heard the hesitation, the reluctance, the unspoken belief that what she saw was impossible or unnecessary. She didn't push back. Not yet. Because she had learned something over years of repetition. Trust cannot be argued into existence. It must be earned quietly. And in the seconds that followed, the world stopped waiting. The mountain erupted not in spectacle, not in chaos, but in a sudden, jarring shift of reality that ripped through the stillness like a hidden truth being forced into the open. The team moved instinctively, each one reaching for shelter, for stability, for survival. Time thinned into fractions, breaths instead of minutes, decisions instead of plans. She dropped into the earth, grounding herself, the cold grit pressing against her gloves, breath steady despite the surge of adrenaline running through her veins. Her mind didn't spiral, it narrowed. Angles, terrain, blind spots, timing, movement, she didn't panic. But she felt something deeper. Responsibility. Her thoughts shifted inward for a heartbeat, not about the threat ahead, but about the feeling of being unheard just seconds before everything changed. It wasn't resentment. It was realization. The kind that hurts quietly. She identified the path no one else could take, the one no one else could even reach. And before she spoke, she hesitated not out of fear for herself, but because she knew what stepping forward meant. Silence, isolation, distance from every voice that could guide or support her. Yet she knew something even more clearly. If she didn't move, no one else could. So she offered the solution. And for a brief moment, the air between voices carried something fragile, not trust, but uncertainty, letting go just enough to make room for possibility. The decision didn't arrive as courage. It arrived as necessity. She moved. Her body cut through the cold air in low, deliberate motion, her boots scraping stone, her balance centered like a quiet promise she refused to break. Breath paced, muscles burning in controlled rhythm. She didn't rush. She didn't freeze. She didn't think of herself at all. Only of the people waiting behind cover, their lives balanced on the thin line between chance and judgment. The narrow opening beneath the ridge waited ahead, dark, small, barely wide enough for someone her size. Others wouldn't fit, couldn't squeeze through, wouldn't even consider it an option. But she didn't see confinement when she looked at it. She saw an opportunity disguised as limitation. And for the first time in years, she felt like the very thing they saw as weakness might finally become strength. Still, there was conflict inside her. Not fear of the tunnel, fear of being forgotten inside it. She pressed forward anyway. The moment she entered the narrow crawl space, the world changed. The sound of the outside faded until only her breath remained, echoing quietly against the metal walls. The heat wrapped around her in slow, heavy waves, the air feeling close and thick, pressing gently against her skin. Every inch she gained cost effort, not loud effort, not dramatic strain, but the slow endurance that grinds into the muscles and asks a deeper question. How badly do you want to continue? She didn't answer with words. She answered with movement. Her shoulders grazed the walls. Her knees dragged across metal warmed by the inner machinery of the structure. The tunnel curved and tightened, asking her repeatedly whether she still wanted to move forward. The darkness didn't intimidate her, it grounded her. It turned the world into breath, motion, thought. Yet inside the stillness, emotion surfaced. Not pride, not fear, a quiet ache. She thought about every time she'd been told she didn't look the part. Every moment someone questioned whether she belonged, not because of her skill, but because of her size, her presence, her silence. She didn't resent them for it. She just wished they understood that strength didn't always arrive in the shape they expected. Her hands moved slowly along the metal surface, palms raw, skin heated beneath layers of grit and fatigue. Sweat gathered at the edge of her brow, but she didn't wipe it away, her movements too valuable to waste. Her breath remained steady, even as the air thinned, even as the tunnel rose at a sharper angle and gravity pulled against her body. There was a moment, a brief, fragile one, when the tunnel narrowed enough to make her stop. Just a second. Just long enough for vulnerability to whisper. What if you can't move forward? She closed her eyes not to block fear, but to listen. Not to sound. To herself. And what answered wasn't bravado. It was quiet resolve. She adjusted her body, shifted, found space in fractions, in patience, in trust in her own awareness. The tunnel allowed her through, inch by inch, not by force, but by understanding how to move with it instead of against it. She carried no anger into the darkness, only determination. And beneath that determination lived a deeper truth, one she'd never spoken aloud. She wasn't trying to prove she was capable. She was trying to prove she had always been enough, even before anyone believed it. So she kept going, not for recognition, not for approval, but because sometimes the smallest path, the narrowest opening, the place no one else can go, is where quiet resilience finally finds its purpose. Why did the quiet inside the facility feel more dangerous than the chaos outside? And why did her heartbeat sound louder now than it had beneath the open sky? When she finally emerged from the narrow crawl space into the dim interior corridors, the world did not greet her with noise or movement. It greeted her with silence, a cold, sterile stillness that made every step feel heavier than the last. She paused in the shadows, breath soft, hands steady, eyes adjusting to the faint glow of emergency lighting that pulsed gently along the ceiling. The air inside felt different, recycled, metallic, humming faintly with unseen systems buried deep within the structure's bones. The tunnel behind her seemed to close itself like a secret she had left behind. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt alone. Not physically, but emotionally. There was no voice in her ear now. No guidance. No acknowledgement. The radio had gone quiet somewhere in the mountain stone, cutting her off from everything except her own judgment. And though she trusted that judgment, the absence of any human presence on the other end of the line made the silence heavier than the air around her. She moved carefully along the narrow passage, each step measured, each breath paced. Not rushed, not frantic, controlled, intentional. The world had shrunk into details again, the soft echo of distant machinery, the faint vibration under her boots, the way each surface reflected just enough light to reveal edges but not depth. She had trained for situations like this. Isolation, limited visibility, uncertainty. But training never captured the quiet emotional truth of being unseen in the very moment you risk everything. Not for credit, not for glory, but because the mission needed someone willing to enter the places no one else could reach. Her thoughts drifted back, not to the gunfire, not to the ridge, but to smaller memories layered across years. Rooms where she had been overlooked, briefings where her words barely registered, conversations where confidence was mistaken for coldness and silence mistaken for weakness. She wasn't angry at anyone. She had simply learned how heavy invisibility could feel when responsibility rested on your shoulders alone. Yet here in this empty corridor, something unexpected emerged. Calm. Not the calm of certainty, but the calm of acceptance. She understood why she was here. Not because she was the smallest. Not because she could fit through the narrow places. But because, somewhere along the way, she had learned how to move through doubt without letting it break her. She passed a corner slowly, checking angles with disciplined patience. Voices murmured faintly in the distance, the kind of casual conversation people have when they feel safe, unaware that danger has entered their world in absolute silence. Her pulse slowed, not from confidence, from responsibility. She didn't rush toward the sound. She stayed grounded, letting the moment stretch into stillness. Every decision from this point forward carried weight, not loud, cinematic weight, but quiet consequence that lived in the space between choice and aftermath. She thought of the team outside, cold, pinned down, still unsure whether she had made it through the mountain alive. She imagined them scanning the ridge, listening to broken static, not knowing whether hope existed on the other side of the silence. A small ache pressed at the back of her throat. Not because they doubted. Because she wished, just once, they could see the effort required to walk alone into the unknown. She moved again, slower now, allowing her senses to lead instead of fear. The corridor opened into a narrow maintenance platform overlooking a lower level. Screens glowed faintly in the distance, faint movements reflecting across polished surfaces. She stayed in the shadows, breath shallow, body still, observing, thinking, deciding. She didn't rush into confrontation. She didn't romanticize courage. She calculated, not mechanically, emotionally, because courage was not the absence of fear. It was the ability to move while carrying it. Her legs trembled softly from fatigue, not weakness, just human limitation pressing against endurance. Her arms felt heavy from the crawl, from the heat, from the weight of the rifle resting across her back. She closed her eyes for a brief second, letting exhaustion pass through instead of settling inside her. Then she continued. Her footsteps became part of the facility's rhythm, blending into the distant hum of generators and ventilation systems. She moved not as an intruder forcing her way forward, but as someone who understood how to exist quietly within another environment without disturbing it. The deeper she went, the more the structure began to feel like a reflection of her own inner world, layered, silent, complex, full of paths others rarely noticed. And somewhere in that realization, a subtle strength emerged. Not pride, not defiance, just presence. She reached a platform overlooking another corridor, cleaner, brighter, clearly important. People passed below in small, routine movements, unaware that their world was about to change. She watched, breathing slowly, resisting every impulse to act before understanding fully. Patience. It was the one thing she had never been celebrated for. Yet it was the thing that had carried her further than strength ever could. She felt the weight of choice again, not just strategic choice, but moral choice. Every action she took inside this place would echo outward, affecting lives, reshaping outcomes in ways that would never be seen on reports or recordings. She wasn't looking for recognition, but she refused to act carelessly. She closed her eyes for one brief second, not to escape the tension, but to remind herself why she was here. Not for revenge, not for dominance, but to protect people who would never know the full story of what happened in this hidden mountain space. When she opened her eyes again, the hesitation was gone. Not replaced with recklessness, but with purpose. She adjusted her grip. Her breath slowed again. She moved forward. And in that moment, standing alone in a quiet corridor beneath the weight of a mountain, surrounded by unseen danger and unanswered doubts, she finally understood something she had never been able to put into words. Strength was not about who could stand tallest. It was about who could continue moving when nobody was there to see it. Why did the wind feel colder up here than it had anywhere else? And why did the view from the tower make the world below seem both fragile and distant at the same time? When she finally stepped out onto the upper platform, the night opened around her like a vast, silent ocean. The valley stretched beneath the cliff, dark and deep, and scattered with faint points of movement. The sky hung low and heavy, clouds drifting across the moon like passing thoughts she couldn't quite hold on to. She paused, not to recover, not to rest, but to breathe. The cold air slid across her face, brushing against sweat that had dried along her brow during the long crawl through the mountain. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion layered across endurance, across hours of tension that had threaded itself into every muscle. She rested one palm against the steel railing, grounding herself in the rough chill of its surface. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel small. Not helpless, just human. She looked down toward the distant ridge where the team was still pinned. They appeared almost unreal from this height, like silhouettes stitched into the landscape, barely visible yet carrying the weight of everything she was here to protect. She imagined the uncertainty below, the doubt, the lingering silence in the radio where her voice should have been. She swallowed. It wasn't absence that hurt. It was knowing they didn't yet know she was still here. The tower creaked softly in the wind, a quiet metallic groan that blended with the distant echoes across the valley. She knelt slowly, every movement deliberate, steadying the rifle against the ledge. Not with dramatics, not with adrenaline. With care. Her breathing found rhythm again, slow in, slow out. The world around her didn't disappear. It sharpened. Lines and shapes and edges merged into a living map, wind direction, terrain curvature, the subtle drift of air brushing past exposed surfaces. She did not think about the distance first. She thought about responsibility, about timing, about restraint. She had never chased impossibility, she chased clarity. And clarity required stillness. She leaned into the scope and the world narrowed, not into a tunnel but into layers, motion over motion, depth over distance. There, beyond the valley floor, faint movement flickered at the edge of her focus. She didn't react. She watched. She waited. Patience had always been her greatest strength and her greatest burden. Because patience meant silence, and silence meant going unnoticed. Her heartbeat slowed. Her hands steadied. Yet inside, something deeper stirred, something close to relief, and just as close to grief. She remembered the moments before, the doubt that hovered in voices, the hesitation in their tone when she first warned them of danger. She wondered, briefly, if things might have been different had her voice held the same weight as theirs. But she didn't hold on to the thought. She let it pass. Because the mountain did not care about pride, and neither did the moment. A faint crackle of static flickered through the headset. Then a voice. Hesitant. Uncertain. Calling her name like a question, rather than a statement. Her chest tightened. Not from fear. From something softer. She answered, steady, calm, almost quiet. The silence that followed was different this time. Not doubt. Not disbelief. But shock giving way to realization. Their voices shifted, not louder, not more confident, just different. The tone carried weight now, concern, relief, a fragile thread of trust cautiously forming across the distance between ridge and tower. For a second she closed her eyes and let that feeling settle, not as validation, but as acknowledgement that, finally, they could see the shape of her presence. Not as an idea. As reality. She turned back to the world below. Her breath softened. Her focus sharpened. She didn't rush. She didn't force timing. She didn't try to prove anything. She simply waited for alignment, for balance between opportunity and consequence. Every choice mattered. Every movement echoed. Her finger rested lightly, never tense, never committed until intention and certainty aligned. The first break in motion appeared subtle, fleeting, and she responded not with urgency, but with clarity. The world paused for a fraction of a second. Then released. Silence followed, not heavy, not dramatic. Just still. She didn't celebrate. She didn't exhale in triumph. She simply adjusted, reassessed, continued. Shot after shot, not rapid, not relentless, but deliberate. Each decision carried its own moral weight. Each act was a promise, not of dominance, but of protection. Below, the team shifted. Voices steadied. Fear loosened. And for the first time since the mission began, she felt the fragile warmth of connection forming, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present in the way they moved now, trusting the unseen stability above them. Yet even as control returned to the field, conflict remained inside her. The mountain wind whispered through the steel beams. The sky seemed wider now, stretching toward a horizon she could barely see. She felt the ache in her arms, the slow burn in her shoulders, the accumulated fatigue of endurance without pause. She could not afford to collapse into relief. Not yet, because relief was fragile, and the mission still unfinished. A quiet moment lingered, long enough for reflection to surface. She thought about the years before this one, The training, the repetition, the countless hours spent refining patience into instinct, not because she wanted to prove herself superior, but because she understood that some roles required a willingness to disappear into precision, to exist not at the center of attention, but at the edge of necessity. And there, in that understanding, she finally recognized the truth she'd avoided admitting, even to herself. She was not fighting for recognition. She was fighting to protect the part of herself that believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. The radio crackled again. Their tone was different now. Respectful, careful, grateful though unspoken. It wasn't praise. It was something deeper, something earned. She didn't respond with confidence or pride. She responded with restraint, because humility wasn't softness. It was strength with its sharpness turned inward. She shifted position, realigning, grounding herself again in the steel beneath her hands. The night deepened around the valley, and the final stage of the mission loomed somewhere in the distance, close enough to feel, far enough to fear. And yet, instead of doubt, she felt calm, not invincible, not heroic, just ready, ready to carry weight no one else could see. Ready to accept that sometimes the greatest strength is not in the glory of what others witness, but in the quiet courage of standing steady when uncertainty surrounds you. Why did the last stage of the mission feel heavier than everything that came before? And why did success suddenly feel as fragile as glass balanced on the edge of a table? The night around her seemed to hold its breath, as if the mountains themselves understood that what happened next would not be decided by strength or speed, but by judgment. She stayed still, not frozen, not uncertain, just present. The wind brushed past her shoulders, soft and cold, carrying faint echoes from the valley below, shifting footsteps, distant movement, restrained voices. The team was repositioning now, slowly, carefully, trusting coverage they could not see but could finally believe in. She heard it in their tone. They no longer spoke over her. They spoke with her. And yet, a quiet ache lingered in her chest, subtle and deep. Not sadness, not relief. Something in between the emotional space where effort meets reality and the past meets the moment you've been walking toward for years without realizing it. She adjusted her position, feeling the dull fatigue in her arms as she steadied the rifle again. Her muscles protested in small, trembling pulses, but her breath smoothed the edges of exhaustion. She wasn't fighting pain. She was managing endurance. She scanned the far horizon not for targets, not for threats, but for truth, for patterns that didn't belong, for motion that felt intentional rather than random. She traced the terrain, ridges folding into valleys, shadows bending across slopes, light flickering faintly along distant gravel. And then she saw it. Not clearly, not fully, just enough. A faint, controlled movement beyond the valley's edge, too measured to be coincidence, too purposeful to be harmless. It didn't rush. It didn't call attention to itself. It tried to disappear. And that, more than anything, revealed its intent. Her pulse slowed not from fear, but from awareness. She didn't speak immediately. She let the moment breathe. Because every word spoken now would carry weight. Not only tactical weight, but emotional weight. She exhaled gently, keeping her tone calm as she described what she saw. Not dramatic, not urgent, just precise. There was a pause on the other end of the radio, not resistance, not dismissal. Reflection. They listened. Really listened. The silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It was trust searching for certainty. Someone asked a careful question, cautious, respectful, not to challenge her, but to understand her perspective more fully. The difference mattered. She felt it. It softened the tension she'd carried in her chest since the beginning of the mission. Still, doubt lingered in the space between decision and consequence. Not their doubt, her own. Because even after everything, even after endurance and silence and patience, she still held herself to a standard no one else had ever asked of her. She didn't want to be right. She wanted to be honest. She focused again, measuring wind against terrain, motion against distance, timing against risk. She wasn't thinking about approval. She wasn't thinking about recognition. She was thinking about responsibility. The world slowed. Not in a dramatic way, not like stories where time freezes, but in a deeply human way, where thought becomes still enough to allow meaning to rise to the surface. And beneath her composure, a quiet conflict stirred. Not fear of failure, fear of misunderstanding, fear that even now they might see the outcome, but never truly understand the cost of the decisions that led to it. She swallowed that feeling gently, not burying it, not denying it, simply placing it aside long enough to do what needed to be done. Because emotion was not the enemy of discipline. It was its reason for existing. The distant movement shifted again, subtle, deliberate, and the reality became clearer. The danger wasn't loud or dramatic. It was patient, hidden, waiting for the moment when hope and relief might loosen vigilance. She understood that feeling too well. Moments of relief were always the most vulnerable. Her voice entered the comms again, steady, grounded, calm, and this time she didn't hesitate when she spoke. Not because she was certain of success, but because she was certain of intent. They trusted her call. No argument, no pause, just acceptance shaped by experience earned the hard way. The weight that settled onto her shoulders in that moment wasn't pressure. It was responsibility finally shared instead of resisted. She repositioned, slow, deliberate, arms aching, fingers stiffening under the cold steel. Her breath formed small clouds that drifted past the scope, dissolving into the wind before returning as soft condensation along the metal. For a heartbeat, fatigue whispered, "Just rest. Just stop. Just let someone else decide." But that wasn't who she was. Not because she needed to prove herself. Because she understood the difference between ego and duty, and she refused to confuse them. She let the world fade into rhythm again, breath, wind, distance, a quiet alignment between experience and instinct. The valley below seemed impossibly far, yet painfully close. The mission balanced on a single, fragile intersection of risk and necessity. Her thoughts drifted just briefly to the years before this one. Training fields at dawn, late nights in empty ranges, failure that had never broken her because it had taught her the meaning of patience instead. She remembered moments when she questioned whether the quiet path she walked would ever be recognized, not publicly, but personally within herself. And now here she was, not triumphant, not glorified, simply present in the moment that all those unseen miles had quietly led her toward. She didn't hesitate, but she didn't rush. She waited for alignment, that silent point where judgment, timing, and purpose met in the smallest fraction of a second. The choice, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like courage. It felt like acceptance. Acceptance of risk. Acceptance of doubt. Acceptance of who she had always been. The world narrowed. She exhaled. And in the soft stillness that followed, there was no explosion of emotion, no overwhelming surge of pride or relief. Just stillness. A quiet, fragile stillness that settled into her chest, like a truth she had been searching for her entire life. Confirmation arrived moments later, not loud, not triumphant, but steady. Measured. Respectful. The voices in her ear changed again, not shocked this time, but grounded. Their tone carried weight, not admiration but understanding. Real understanding. And that meant more than anything. She didn't smile. She didn't tremble. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and let the silence rest gently around her. Not empty silence, not isolating silence. Shared silence. The kind that exists between people who have finally seen one another clearly. The mission wasn't over. There were still decisions ahead. Still miles to walk. Still uncertainty waiting beyond the next moment. But something inside her had shifted, not outwardly visible, not loud or dramatic, just enough to soften the edges of the burden she had carried alone for so long. For the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost moving through the unseen spaces of the world. She felt present, seen, respected not because of a single act, but because of the quiet, unwavering resilience that had always been there. And as the wind moved through the tower again, cold and steady and unchanging, she realized something she had never truly allowed herself to believe. The mission might define the moment, but the dignity she carried through it defined her. Why did the silence after the mission feel heavier than the danger itself? And why did the stillness in the mountains linger longer inside her than any sound ever had? When the final call went through and the valley began to breathe again, she didn't move right away. She stayed there on the tower, hands resting against the cold steel, breath slow, eyes fixed on the distant horizon that had carried so much uncertainty only moments before. The world below shifted back into motion, footsteps, careful words, movement shaped not by panic anymore but by relief. Yet up here, everything felt suspended. The wind brushed past her face, cold and patient, like a reminder that the mountain would forget all of this long before she ever could. She exhaled, not in triumph, not in exhaustion, just release. The weight she had carried through the crawlspace, through the corridors, through the stillness of long decisions, it didn't fall away all at once. It softened, it loosened, it became something else. Not a burden, not a wound. A memory. She gathered her gear with slow, deliberate movements. Her muscles protested in quiet pulses, the kind of fatigue that comes not from effort alone, but from holding emotion steady for too long. Her arms ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. Her legs wobbled slightly when she stood. None of it surprised her. Endurance always left echoes. She took one last look at the valley, not to admire the view, not to mark the distance, but to acknowledge what the night had asked of her. Responsibility, restraint, reflection. She didn't feel larger because of it. She didn't feel changed in a way the world would see. The change lived somewhere deeper. Within the quiet. Within herself. The radio clicked softly. Her name spoken gently this time, not as a question, not as a command. As recognition. She hesitated before answering, not out of uncertainty, but because the moment felt fragile, like something that needed to be handled with care. She replied calmly, her voice steady, grounded, almost softer than before. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Respect doesn't shout. It arrives quietly and stays. She began her descent from the tower, each step slow, careful, testing the strength that remained in her legs. The metal ladder vibrated faintly beneath her hands. The cold bit into her skin where the gloves had worn thin. The wind carried the faint echo of distant winter air through the beams. And as she climbed down, a thought passed through her mind, simple, honest, unembellished. She was tired. Not from the mission. From the years that had led to it. When she reached the ground, the earth felt unfamiliar beneath her boots, solid, yet strangely fragile. Footprints marked the snow, scattered and overlapping like pieces of unfinished conversation. She walked toward the extraction point in silence, the night slowly giving way to the earliest suggestion of dawn. They saw her before she saw them. The team didn't cheer, didn't rush, didn't try to wrap the moment in noise. They simply stood there, not in formation, not in shock, just present. Their eyes carried something she had never seen before, not awe, not apology, but understanding shaped by humility. The distance between them wasn't measured in steps anymore. It was measured in perspective. One of them nodded. Small, sincere, human. She returned the gesture, just as small, because anything more would have broken the quiet honesty of the moment. Words would have cheapened it. Explanations would have scattered it. Sometimes acknowledgement has no language. They walked together across the snow, their steps slow, careful, weighted not by fear, but by the reality of what they had just survived. No one tried to fill the silence. No one tried to interpret it. They simply shared it. Inside the transport vehicle, the noise of the engine hummed softly beneath their feet. She leaned back against the cold interior panel, closing her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to let her body finally understand that the danger had passed. Her hands trembled slightly, not from shock, from release. Fatigue draped itself over her like a heavy blanket, but beneath it, something gentler existed. Not joy, not relief. Peace. A quiet peace that arrived not because she had been right, but because she had remained true to herself when it mattered most. The others glanced her way from time to time, not starring, not studying, just acknowledging presence. One of them started to speak, then stopped, then simply nodded again. It was enough. She thought back to the beginning of the mission, to the briefing table, to the hesitant glances, to the doubt that had hovered like fog around her shoulders. The memory didn't sting anymore. It didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a distance she had crossed, not through defiance, but through dignity. And she realized something she had never fully allowed herself to see. The mission had not changed how capable she was. It had simply revealed what had always been there. The landscape outside shifted slowly as the vehicle moved along the frozen path. The sky lightened at the edges, soft colors blooming quietly across the horizon. Morning didn't arrive with brilliance or drama. It arrived like she did. Calm, grounded, unannounced. Her thoughts wandered, not to recognition, not to legacy, but to smaller questions. Would this change anything? Would the next room be different? Would the next table feel less isolating? She didn't know. And for the first time, that uncertainty didn't hurt. Because she no longer needed proof. She had already found what she had been searching for, not in distance, not in precision, not in the silence of endurance, but in the understanding that her worth had never depended on whether others recognized it. The mission report would never capture that. The records would reduce it to numbers, timelines, logistics, sterile and distant. They would never speak of the tunnel heat, the press of metal, the quiet ache of isolation, or the fragile stillness after responsibility finally lifted. They would never mention the part that mattered most, the part only she carried. And she was at peace with that, because not every story is meant to be told loudly. Some are meant to be lived quietly and remembered privately. The vehicle slowed as they neared the final checkpoint. The team prepared to step out, shoulders heavy, eyes tired, hearts somewhere between relief and reflection. She stood slowly, steadying herself with one hand against the interior wall. One of them paused beside her. No long speech. No elaborate gratitude. Just a simple sentence, spoken softly, respectfully, without theatrics. "We're glad you were there." Her chest tightened. Not with pride. With something far more meaningful. Validation not of ability, but of presence. She nodded once. Nothing more. They stepped out into the pale morning light. The mountains stood quiet again, as if nothing had happened, as if the night had simply passed like all the others before it. But she knew better. Something had shifted. Not in the world. In her. She walked forward with the others, not ahead of them, not behind, but alongside. Equal. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to explain. She didn't need to be louder to be heard. Because sometimes strength does not declare itself. Sometimes resilience doesn't shout. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.